Welcome back. This is Principles of Macroeconomics, and I am Liam Malloy, coming to you from the beautiful University of Rhode Island. And this is the first video for Chapter 7, where we are going to look in more detail about international economics. And so we'll talk a little bit about trade, so imports and exports, so goods that are produced in one country and sold in another country. We'll talk a little bit about exchange rates, and so the price of one currency in terms of another. And we'll talk a lot about sort of different exchange rate regimes. And so deciding whether to fix your exchange rate to the value of another currency, to let it float in the international financial markets. And international economics can be a little confusing. I think partly that's because when we talk about international trade or exchange rates, it really depends on your perspective, right? So one country's import is another country's export. When one country's currency appreciates, the other country's currency depreciates. And that's, of course, only looking at two countries, right? Which is kind of what we'll often do. But we also want to think about, multiple countries, because that's the way the world actually is. All right, so let's get going here. The global economy, I think if you think about sort of the history of macroeconomics, there have been a few big increases in international trade. So one big increase was before World War I, and that sort of collapsed after World War I. It recovered a little bit, but then we had the Great Depression and World War II, and trade was actually fairly low after World War II as countries started to rebuild themselves. And then there was a fairly sort of slow but significant increase in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then increased much more quickly in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, especially with the growth of China. So we'll do an introduction in this video and talk we'll introduce the sort of different exchange rate regimes that we'll talk about. And then we will sort of go into more depth into those exchange rate regimes. We'll look at sort of where countries fall in our, groups of regimes in the real world. Then we'll look at global financial markets, which are very important, right? Because you have global capital that can move from country to country. That can be very beneficial for countries, that can attract foreign direct investment, help them build factories, help them adopt new technology, but it can also be very painful when that global capital leaves quickly. All right, and so this is a 100, I don't know, thousands, millions, billions, $1 trillion bill from Zimbabwe during their experience with hyperinflation. We talked a little bit about hyperinflation in the last chapter. But we'll talk about it more in this chapter as well. And really what happens is that the value of the currency just falls so quickly because of this extreme inflation that it basically becomes worthless, and the economy sort of grinds to a halt. And so then the question is, well, why do countries get themselves into that position in the first place? And two, what can they do to get out of it? And Zimbabwe is only one example, right? So we've had periods of hyperinflation in the interwar periods in Germany and Austria and Hungary. We've had hyperinflation in Russia, in Bolivia, in Argentina recently. Fortunately, that seems to be recovering. So it's a very common occurrence. And really the reason is when countries want to run a budget deficit, but are unable to borrow, and so try to finance that budget deficit by increasing the money supply. All right, so if we think about, what's sort of motivating our discussion here, one of the motivations is sort of the different inflation rates that have been experienced by different countries, right? We just saw the $100 trillion bill from Zimbabwe. If we look, at these three countries, Spain, the UK, and Germany, we can see that Spain and the UK similar to the United States, experienced very high inflation in the 70s and 80s. Actually, it was even higher in Spain and the UK. Whereas Germany was able to get through that period with only modest inflation. Um, Whereas they all three sort of experienced fairly significant inflation in the post-COVID years, which we can sort of see over here. So one of the things we want to talk about, we talked about sort of inflation targeting as for monetary policy, but we want to think about, okay, well, how are exchange rates related to that question? All right, so we'll talk about different exchange rate mechanisms and how that impacts both imports and exports, but also inflation. We'll explain sort of why countries might fix exchange rate and also what the consequences of that would be. And then we will discuss sort of global capital mobility, right? So if you think about global capital, it becomes this sort of amorphous boogeyman sometimes, where capital rushes into a country and then rushes out of a country. But really, what global capital is just a bunch of individuals and institutions, banks, hedge funds, etc., looking for the best return, right? And so when they can find a higher return in one country versus another country, then the money moves to that higher return. All right. So let's talk about our sort of different exchange rate regimes and even what we mean by exchange rate regimes. But first, we have to sort of go back a little bit to Chapter 5. And so in Chapter 5, we talked about monetary policy, right? We talked about the central bank, Federal Reserve in the United States, that is targeting a policy interest rate in order to try to smooth out the business cycle, keep inflation at its target, and keep unemployment and GDP at their supply side equilibrium. And so, okay, that's fine. What we sort of want then is, for a successful monetary policy, is to try to anchor inflationary expectations, right? And so if we can keep inflationary expectations at the target inflation rate, then we should be at our sort of natural rate of unemployment and GDP, and inflation should be under control. Now, we also talked about sort of how targeting that policy interest rate actually leads to, changes in aggregate demand, changes in the bargaining gap, and therefore changes in inflation. We only talked a little bit about the exchange rate because we hadn't really introduced that concept too much. So we're going to come back to that in this chapter because the exchange rate can both affect exports and imports, right, which will affect aggregate demand directly. And so when our exchange rate appreciates and we can buy more foreign currency with our currency, that makes our imports cheaper, and so we buy more imports, but it makes our exports more expensive, and so we sell fewer exports. And so an appreciation actually leads to a decrease in our net exports and a decrease in aggregate demand. Similarly, a depreciation makes imports more expensive, so we buy fewer of them. Exports cheaper, so we sell more of them. That improves our net exports and improves aggregate demand. But there's also another channel here for looking at import prices, right? So an appreciation will have a direct impact on import prices, as will a depreciation, and affect inflation directly. So, for example, for a country that imports a lot of food and or fuel, if there's a big depreciation of the currency, then those imports become more expensive, and food and fuel are necessities of life, and so that can drive inflation directly from a depreciation. All right, so let's just remember our nominal and real exchange rates, and we just want to remember that this book flips them from the normal way, or at least the usual way that books often think about them. And so, I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? Exchange rates are just a ratio of, foreign currency to domestic currency or domestic currency to foreign currency. And the way that this book sets it up is that a depreciation is an increase in the exchange rate, and an appreciation is a decrease in the exchange rate. And the reason that they do that is that they want to define our real exchange rate, which they call C, um, as competitiveness, right? And so competitiveness basically says, all right, well, how expensive are our goods compared to other countries' goods? And so an increase in C, a depreciation, means our domestic goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods. And so our competitiveness increases. So just keep in mind that, often what you'll see is, for instance, if you're in the United States, you'll see yen per dollar or pounds per dollar or um, pesos per dollar. And so in this case, we're looking at the inverse, where if our home country is the US, it would be dollar per yen, dollar per peso, dollar per pound. Sort of oddly, the one exchange rate that is often reported this way is the euro exchange rate, which is dollars per euro often. I don't understand why they aren't always consistent. But so keep in mind that's what we're talking about, and that to convert our nominal exchange rate, which we call E, to our real exchange rate, we have to multiply it by the ratio of the foreign price level, so like the foreign CPI, to the domestic price level, the domestic CPI. And that will give us our what we're calling C. All right. So if we have an exchange rate between two countries, right, we can think about sort of two ways that that exchange rate gets determined. One is we could have a flexible exchange rate. And most of the exchange rates that I've been talking about, the dollar to yen, dollar to euro, dollar to pound, dollar to peso, dollar to yuan, mostly dollar to yuan, are flexible exchange rates. And they are determined in the foreign exchange market. Now, the foreign exchange market is absolutely gigantic. They trade something like 6 or 7 or $8 trillion of currencies per day. Most of that trade has the dollar on one side. So the most trades will be trading either dollars for pesos, pesos for dollars, dollars for euros, pounds for dollars. Not all of them, right? But most of them will be traded that way. That's not how we have traditionally done exchange rates. So if you go back even 70 years, we had a fixed exchange rate regime where the government sets the target exchange rate and the central bank is responsible for making sure that it follows that fixed exchange rate. And so, for example, you might have $2 per pound or 5 francs per dollar back before the euro. And that's traditionally how we did it. I mean, if you go even farther back when countries were on the gold standard, then basically every country was saying, okay, here is how much our currency is worth in terms of gold. And if every country was doing that and kept that price constant, then that's the same as having a fixed exchange rate. Now, the benefits of a fixed exchange rate we'll talk about, right? But mostly it's to reduce the amount of uncertainty that comes with flexible exchange rates. So if you are engaged in international trade, you need to know, all right, well, how many euros am I going to get per dollar? How many pesos am I going to get per dollar, so that I know, how much these things are going to cost me. With a fixed exchange rate, you always know that. With a flexible exchange rate, it can fluctuate a fair amount. And so you have to pay more attention to it. So fixed exchange rate regimes basically say, all right, we will always trade this amount of our currency for the other currency, right? Now, traditionally, that's often been dollars, but not always, right? Often, if it's not dollars, it's probably a fixed exchange rate to your sort of major trading partner, right? So if you are near the European Union, you might fix it to the euro. If you're near to Japan, you might fix it to the yen. If you're near to China, you might fix it to the yuan. And the important piece here is that interest rates become non-independent, right? So if you change your interest rate, and then people will say, okay, well, if you raise your interest rate, people will be like, oh, I really want to buy your bonds because now I can get higher interest from your bonds than from other bonds. But I'm going to have to trade, currencies in order to buy your bond. And so that becomes a problem. And so countries with a fixed exchange rate can't use monetary policy to smooth out their business cycle. And so that's a cost of having a fixed exchange rate. And it might be worth it in some cases if it really improves your trading ability, but often economists think that it's not worth it. Now we'll talk about, for instance, the euro that is a fixed exchange rate, using the exact same currency for the euro zone. So we're going to look at sort of three different types of exchange rate regimes, and we'll talk about them in more depth in the next video. But we'll call them Flexit, which is a flexible exchange rate with inflation targeting. So that is the United States, the European Union, the UK, sort of most developed countries. FlexNit, which is a flexible exchange rate with no stable inflation targeting. And this is the one that's dangerous, right? Because without stable inflation targeting, then there's the danger that you end up with higher and higher inflation and potentially hyperinflation. And then a fixed exchange rate, which is called FIX, which, as we said, just fixes the exchange rate between two currencies, or sometimes for a whole basket of currencies, right? You might take a weighted average of the currencies and say, okay, our currency is going to be worth that much compared to those currencies. All right, so we'll stop there, and in the next video, we'll go into more depth in looking at each of those different types of exchange rate regimes.